This first quarter GDP number.
UK GDP in the fourth quarter.
Much bigger GDP.
Gross domestic product (GDP) is a measurement that seeks to capture a country's economic output. At the same time, GDP can also be defined as the market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a year. Therefore, countries with higher GDP generate more goods and services and as a result, enjoy a higher standard of living. Hence, GDP can be classified to four types, which are real GDP, nominal GDP, actual GDP, and the last one is potential GDP.
It is a useful concept for macroeconomic policy, and obviously the Bank of England and the Treasury, or their equivalents in other countries, need to have some idea of how growth is going to know how to set macroeconomic policy. So we need something like it.
Basic concept of GDP was invented by Simon Kuznets at the end of the 18th century. The modern concept was developed in 1934 and approved as the main measure of a country's economy at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. In 1934, Simon Kuznets, an economist, presented the original formulation of GDP. His idea is to accumulate all economic production by individuals, businesses, and the government into a single measure that will rise in good times and fall in bad. Meanwhile, in 1944, after the Bretton Woods Conference, GDP became the standard tool for measuring a country's economy. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has reshuffled the world's greatest economy and businesses, throwing several countries into their severe economic downturn throughout modern years. Hence, COVID-19 pandemic has caused global health impact and governments have restricted movement to a certain extent, and such restrictions have led to disruption in economic activities. It is, however, giving a bad impact to economic countries around the world. The closest example that can be taken is our own country. Malaysia's GDP shrinks to 5.6% in 2020.
One type of GDP is nominal GDP. It estimates the market value of all finished goods and services produced in an economy but doesn't strip out changes in price levels or inflation and can therefore overstate or understate the real economic value. Still, nominal GDP values denominated in a common currency are a way of measuring and comparing economic sizes of different countries and provide a glimpse of how development, such as the pandemic, affect economies differently. There are some large economies of countries that suffered losses during the pandemic, such as the United States, which had recorded 21,433.225 billion nominal GDP in 2019 before the pandemic, and decreased by -2.92% in 2020. In addition, countries like Japan were also affected by the pandemic, especially in the tourism sector, when it recorded a decline of -3.33% of nominal GDP in 2020. While many countries are affected in terms of nominal GDP, there are a few countries that have had an increase in their nominal GDP even slightly. Countries like China recorded a 3.33% increase in nominal GDP in 2020 compared to 2019. This could happen because consumption has also become increasingly resilient to virus outbreaks, thanks in part to a rise in online shopping. The country's manufacturing and export sectors like China and Egypt remain strong despite the virus uncertainty.
Purchasing power parity refers to the exchange rate of two different currencies that are going to be in equilibrium, and the PPP formula can be calculated by multiplying the cost of particular product or services with the first currency by the cost of the same goods or services in dollars. PPPs are also used in other international indicators of economic socio-economic development. The United States remained the economy with the highest level of per capita consumption at nearly $45,000 in PPP terms, more than 4 times the world average. The pandemic is hurting emerging economies in at least 3 ways: by locking down their population, damaging their export earnings, and deterring foreign capital. Even if the pandemic fades in the second half of the year, GDP in developing countries measured at purchasing power parity will be 6.6% smaller in 2020. Hence, the PPP rate of the country has been affected because of the pandemic COVID-19. For example, T20 countries such as United States have decreased from 3.98% in 2019 to negative 2.92% in 2021, while OIC countries like UAE also have a big difference from 3.9% to negative 5.25% on 2020, and Malaysia also experienced the same situation, which is decreasing from 5.52% in 2019 to negative 5.88% in 2020. It has shown how big the impact of the PPP rate was to the country during the pandemic COVID-19.
The expenditure approach of the GDP is a method of measuring GDP by calculating all spending throughout the economy, including household consumption, gross private domestic investment, government purchases, and net exports. In other words, this method measures what our country produces by assuming that the finished goods and services of a country equals to the amount spent in the country for that time period. This is the most common way to measure and calculate nominal GDP. The expenditure method formula is calculated by adding up the household consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. To sum up, the equation for expenditure approach GDP will be C plus I plus G plus Xn. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected the gross domestic product in Malaysia. For household consumption in Malaysia, it has shown a sharp decline when COVID-19 started to hit Malaysia in early 2020 with a decline of 25%. As for investment, the decline that has been shown when COVID-19 started to hit is not too high, which is at 1% from the previous quarter. For government spending, it also shows a decrease in line with the household consumption, which is around 25%. Lastly, net exports are no exception to receive the impact of COVID-19. The decline shown in net exports was the highest at 114%, causing Malaysia to record a negative net export in April 2020. This shows that the COVID-19 pandemic really has some impacts toward the country's GDP.
One of the type of GDP approach is the income approach. The income to measuring the gross domestic product (GDP) is based on the accounting reality that all expenditure in an economy should equal to the total income generated by the production of all economic goods and services. It also assumes that there are 4 major factors of production in an economy and that all revenue must go to one of these sources. Therefore, by adding together all of these sources of income, a quick estimate can be made of the total productive value of economic activity over a period. Adjustment then must be made for taxes, depreciation, and foreign factor payments. The overall sources of income for the people is really affected during this pandemic. The current COVID-19 pandemic crisis and the economic shutdown due to sanitary measures led to unprecedented rise in the numbers of workers absent from work or working reduced hours, and an increased number of job loss. In the year 2019, average monthly salary in Malaysia was around 3.2 thousand Malaysian ringgit, while in 2020 it stayed about the same but with a higher unemployment rate of Malaysia that increased to 5% in May 2020 from 3.32% in 2019. That will lead to a lower amount of GDP.
Next, the production approach, which is one of the ways to calculate the gross domestic product. It is also known as the output approach that focuses on finding the total output of a nation by directly finding the total value of all goods and services a nation produces. In the output approach, there are 3 main economic sectors, which are agriculture, manufacturing, and service sector. The formula is final value of all goods and services minus intermediate costs.
Malaysia is a country where the manufacturing sector, including electronics, has emerged as the leading economic sector, followed by agriculture like livestock and oil palm.
And for services, Malaysia was supported by wholesale, retail trade, information and communication. Malaysia leads the world in the production of rubber and is one of the biggest producers of things like cocoa, palm oil and tropical hardwoods. In 2020, COVID-19 has come and many countries have made a total lockdown for their countries, including lockdown for the business activity that has affected their GDP production approach. Malaysia also have been affected since there is a decrease in the GDP production sector for 2020. Before the pandemic, which is in 2019, the services sector is at 6.1%, manufacturing at 3.8% and agriculture at 2%. All of this percentage has increased from 2018, but in 2020, it has shown that all three economic sectors has declined growth rate due to restriction on economic activity on the production sector resulting from containment measure in response to COVID-19 pandemic.